We've got a bombshell report here from ESPN that's breaking inside Robert Sarver's 17-year tenure as owner of the Phoenix Suns. If you've been listening to this show for a long time, you know Amin Elhassan is a former Suns executive, and he's told you a lot of the stories about how Sarver is a bit of a nincompoop. And now this story comes out from ESPN, and it's got toxic environment all over it. It's got racism, it's got misogyny. It's pretty exhaustively reported. A lot of anonymous sources, but a lot of Earl Watsons and Corliss Williamsons putting their name on things, and it is comprehensive. And if you were watching this like a week ago, you could tell as Sarver went on the offensive that ESPN and ESPN's lawyers had already sent the accusations. And so Sarver started denying before the story came out. Now the story has come out, and Amin Elhassan is on with us. He has read the story. So the details here that stood out to you and how it compared to your experience with the Suns was what? How long were you with the Suns? I mean, how long did you work under Sarver? Because you've told us that he was a tyrant and kind of lacking in self-awareness.
Yeah, and I think lacking in self-awareness is the big thing when it comes to him. I was there for 6 seasons, and reading the article was very interesting for me, Dan, because there's a lot of, yep, I remember that. Yep, that happened. Yep, I could see that happening. Wait a second. Is that my direct quote verbatim that someone just provided on my behalf? Because I didn't talk to the reporter who wrote this story. And then there are other things where like, oh, I didn't know that happened. Or, wow, that happened? And so for me, it was a lot of, it's weird. I was telling Whitty right before we went on air, he remarked, because I was just doing radio, it must have been hard to try to process this while you're doing radio. And I said, it's hard in general, but then specifically because so much of this is in my work history where I experienced some of this stuff. You're doing this kind of inventory of, wait, did that happen? Was I there for that? Or did I hear that from someone else? And it's just kind of surreal. It's like, as you said, Dan, I've talked about some of these things a lot over the years, and now you see a full-blown expose about it, and you're like, oh, wow, there it is in black and white.
It didn't have the details, though, that you have women so uncomfortable that they're talking about suicide anonymously. A black employee being asked to dance like Carlton, not by Sarver, but by others. So how many of the stories, Sarver showing the pictures of his wife to players trying to fit in and talking about oral sex. So what's happening here? I mean, is this just clueless billionaire behavior? This is rich white guy who's used to behaving however he wants with human beings that of all colors and creeds that he has no respect for.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of everything. I think the part of it is, or the majority of it is Robert's a billionaire, and he's been rich his whole life. Robert's father was a millionaire. Like Robert's success story is like, oh, he started his own bank when he was 21. And I said, well, how many people can start their own bank? Like, that's not, Paul Bunyan-esque, like pulled himself up by the bootstraps. And so he's really out of touch with what regular people are like, right? And then within that, then there is, I'm sure, what exists in almost every white person in this country. Just a level of, at best, racial insensitivity. At worst, just a refusal to understand or listen to people tell you, hey, this isn't cool. And so within that, when I'm reading some of these stories and I'm hearing them, Dan, I'm not saying, oh, yeah, I remember that when I was there for that. But I'm saying, makes sense. I believe it. That's something that I can imagine, like the passing around of the picture of his wife. I didn't see the picture, but if you told me that, hey, there's an NBA owner who passed a picture of his wife in a bikini around, that in my first and probably only guess, and we have a lot of terrible owners in this league, my first and only guess would be Robert Sarver.
He's kind of the closest thing that there's been to Sterling in the league, right? Because this is going to get a lot of play, and the N-word is going to get a lot of play, even though the way he's accused of using it is, cluelessly, but talking about quoting others using it, and if others can use it, why can't he use it? Just in quotes, not calling anybody by name here. I mean, the N-word, right? That's not what you have in the story. That's going to get a lot of the attention today, but there's plenty of other stuff in here that's plenty bothersome. And I think in the case of Sterling, those owners wanted him out anyway. And so they just
Right.
pushed him out on the last thing. I'm not sure this is going to rise to that level unless the animosity for Sarver is such that everybody wants him out because he's a bit of a buffoon, right? He's, after Sterling, he's the guy with the worst reputation among other owners, correct?
Yes, in that sense, in that regard, his reputation within the owner community, I think, is one of, again, at best a nuisance, at worst a loose cannon. But I do want to say, when you say the closest thing to Sterling, I want to remind everybody, a lot of these ownership groups have some not so hidden skeletons in their closet. The ownership group behind the Oklahoma City Thunder were famous for funding anti-gay legislation in California, a state that they had nothing to do with. The DeVos family, the ownership family behind Orlando, they've got some anti-LGBTQ stuff in their past. We know Jim Dolan, when Black Lives Matter was happening, was really defiant. Like, why? Why do I have to say it? Why do we, what if I don't believe in that? So I don't want to paint it out to be like, oh, Robert's the problem child and everybody else is cool, because the reality is there's this everywhere. And again, I believe this is something that exists a lot among rich people. Really, really, really rich people live a different reality than us. Their interactions with people of minorities and of different sexual orientations and all that are a lot more limited. And they draw whatever conclusions they want. And most importantly, they don't have people who are willing, for the most part, to tell them, hey, man, that ain't cool. That's not how you talk about people. Now, in the case of Robert, again, there were several people who have explained to him how he can't say these words. But I think part of it also is that Robert thinks that it's cool because it makes him cool. And I don't necessarily think that that's accurate, for one, but also I don't know that he's actually actively walking around using the N-word other than in those kinds of situations.
You never saw it, right?
I never heard him use the N-word. I've heard him speak pejoratively about women in the sense of like kind of, hey, quote unquote, one of the boys, what Donald Trump once called locker room talk. I've heard him speak in that way. Some of the stories, including the one about manscaping, I was present for. And
well, what are the details on that story? That's an oral sex story. He's telling in front of others about enjoying being manscaped as his wife fillets him.
Yes, that the manscaping made fellatio a much more attractive proposition for his wife. And then he proceeded to do like an impromptu survey of all the players in the room who here manscapes. And then he would try to guess. He's like, what about you? You look like you don't. And look, what he says in a lot of these stories, like the pantsing story, which I wasn't around for, but I've seen.
Tell the people the story. If they've not read the story, what is the pantsing story?
So during the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge, they had an all-employee thing where they're doing this. And in the middle of it, he goes up to one of the employees and pulls his pants down. Pantsing is, the Randy from Family Guy, right? Like just pull down the pants, and the guy's there with his underwear out. And afterward, someone from HR said, ha, but yeah, please don't sue us for sexual harassment. And so that type of, again, what I think he imagines, this is how the jocks have fun and tell jokes. That was very prevalent and continuous. We used to have a Christmas holiday party every year under Mr. Colangelo. And in it, like, it was like, they would just pull out raffle numbers and be like, 7545. Your mortgage or your rent is paid for the year, right? And that was it. That was the intent of the whole thing. And he would do like multiples of these. When Robert came along, they kept doing it, but like Robert wanted some amount of performative action. So it would be like a dance party or you got a dance off, and people were urged to go above and beyond basically in order to quote unquote earn this free mortgage or earn this car note paid or whatever. So these are all, if you see, there are multiple stories where he does something and someone says, that's not cool. And the response now is like, yes, now we realize it wasn't cool. At the time, it was just a joke, and everybody in the room seemed to have a laugh and get a kick out of it. That, to me, is probably the most accurate self-describal of describing of Robert by himself and his lawyers, which also unwittingly incriminates him on some level. He does this. He says, oh, but it was a joke, and everybody laughed, but not realizing, yeah, it's not cool. There's this story of talking about flying women in, if that'll help you guys play better. And he said, oh, yeah, everybody laughed, but there was a female staffer there who was appalled by it because, of course, the idea is that, like, it's like, I'll give you a new PlayStation if you play harder, right? Just women or objects. And I think, again, all of it stems from Robert's desire to want to fit in, but what he doesn't realize, other than that's not how most of these guys talk anyway, but more importantly, even if it were, you're not a player. You are the owner of the team. A fact that you are quick to remind people when they do defy you, as was outlined in the story. The idea that Robert is quick to tell you, if you don't like it, you can leave. A very low-level, innocent version of that story I've told before, I think, on the show. We used to play pickup ball on game days on the main floor. Me, the trainers, the video coordinators, sometimes some of the assistant coaches. It was just, good way to get exercise and blow off some steam. Robert comes by one day, and he says, can I play? And, of course, none of us are going to say no. So he comes like, okay, you'll be on this team. And really quickly, I didn't realize what was happening, but all my buddies were like, I got Jay, I got so-so, I got so-and-so. I'm like, oh, you sons of bitches. You left me to be the guy who's got to guard Robert. So like, okay, now I got to guard this dude. I can't completely ignore him because then it'll be obvious. But I also can't guard him for real because I will fucking destroy him if I do that. So I'm doing this weird in-between, sorry about the cuss, this weird in-between like token defense thing. Now, the Suns, we used to have a defensive set called Haslam. Haslam meant if someone we're playing against is a really good post-up guy, like Shaq, and the guy with the ball is 20 feet away and isn't that great of a shooter, like Haslam, when you hear Haslam, you're supposed to drop back off of the guy with the ball and sit in the lap of the guy in the post, Shaq. The idea is like, let him shoot. We don't care. We're not going to let this ball go in. So we had one of I believe our director of team security was a pretty bulky guy, and he was a good post-up guy. So Robert had the ball, and I forgot because I'm playing pickup, and we do this all the time to each other, dicking around, and I yell out, Haslam, and I sink back, and Robert shoots it, misses, and then says to me, just remember, Haslam has a job. Now, again, I know it's a joke. I didn't get fired after the game. But also, I know, dude, it's different when you're the boss. You can't make those kind of jokes because some people take that shit seriously.
Whittingham and Cody, I would like your thoughts specifically on, I have called Amin Elhassan for an emergency session where we're talking about racist, misogynistic, and toxic workplace, and he just told a 3-minute story about Sarver being Sarver as he yelled Haslam at him. You can't give me a better story than that from your years. I mean, we've got this bombshell report that has misogyny in it, women talking about wanting to commit suicide and their lives wrecked from working in this environment, and you're giving me the story of the time you guarded Sarver in a pickup game.
I think what I gave you was a very basic low-level example that then you can see extrapolated that this is the type of guy who makes these jokes, who takes things very lightly until, his kind of self-confidence or whatever takes a hit, and then he lashes out.
But which is it, though? A total exertion of power or a racist, misogynistic, toxic work environment? Because you've been hard.
Can it be both?
You've been hard on this guy, though. You have been tough on him for 7 or 8 years, or I guess, for a long time. You've been tough on that. You've been his most vocal mainstream critic because you're one of the few people who actually cares about the Suns organization nationally. And what surprised you in this story?
Well, I mean, I think what you said about the female employees feeling like contemplating suicide, and I don't know when that employee worked there, but all I could think of was it's someone I know. It's someone I know who is going through this. We all kind of went through it. The security office used to have a code word when he's in the building. And they would switch it up. The goldfish is in the bowl. They'd say something like that across the airways so everyone would know he's here. Because, again, this is a guy who's a loose cannon. You don't know how he's going to react from day to day. And so we all as employees went through it, but obviously some people were going through it a lot harder, depending on whether they had to deal with him directly on a regular basis, and depending on what kind of loose cannon things he said on that day. And so for me, in a very navel-gazing way, Dan, I read this and I felt bad because I was like, how many of my friends and my coworkers were going through this? And I didn't know. I just thought we were all just bitching about Robert being a terrible boss.
Amin, what do you think about the Earl Watson situation there, how Robert Sarver handled that?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, I want to applaud Earl and Corliss for putting their names on it. Because when you have a story like this, it's really easy for people to not want to have a backlash. And there's always a potential for backlash, even for an Earl Watson and a Corliss Williamson. When you speak out against power in this league, we see it time and time again. Whistleblowers, everyone pats them on the back for blowing the whistle. And then a lot of times they are excommunicated from the profession that they love and they were just looking out for. I thought what happened with Earl with regard to whether he quoted Draymond saying, I believe Earl. If Earl said that happened, I believe him.
This is the backstory for the people who have not read the story. Draymond Green, this is the quote because it's Earl Watson is quoted extensively throughout this story, and he leads the story. And after a loss, Sarver entered the coach's locker room, according to Watson telling this to ESPN. You know, why does Draymond Green get to run up the court and say N-word? Sarver said. He's white, obviously, repeating the N-word several times in a row. You can't say that, Watson, who is black and Hispanic, told Sarver. Why? Sarver replied. Draymond Green says, and then uses the word, and Watson comes back with, you can't bleeping say that. And there are other stories from Earl Watson in here that are not quite that, but similar.
Yeah. So, and the idea here again is that Robert is quoting someone else is his would-be defense, and something, by the way, that he has admitted to doing in his defense. He said, oh, that happened years ago with someone else, and ever since then, I've never done it again. But if there's anything about Robert's pattern of behavior, it's like, well, he doesn't strike you as a guy who's learned his lesson from a past experience. Another example, I'll give you a great example of that. There was a video that I saw of Robert, and I thought this was public, and apparently it's not. Robert Sarver on the team plane, wearing sunglasses, a do-rag, and one of the players' gold chain, sitting at the card table on the plane. And it's easy to see if someone's going to do that. It's not that far of a leap to be the guy who feels comfortable enough to use the N-word, even if he's just quoting someone else. But the thing that I do know about Earl is that Earl was let go because of his ties to Rich Paul and the whole Rich Paul Bledsoe thing. That I know. I know that from when that story happened. I don't know that from Earl. I know that from my own connections and reporting, I guess you want to call it that. And so, and Earl makes a great point there. It's like, if you wanted to fire me because of a conflict of interest, wouldn't that have come up when you were negotiating with a representative from Clutch Sports?
But you need to explain to people what the problem, one of the many things that Sarver is accused of here, as well as being quoted as saying he's not for diversity, is the idea that Clutch Sports would ever have a chance with someone like Robert Sarver, right? Like, you've got what's at the heart of this tension, is it not? I mean, as it relates maybe to Watson, because Sarver is accusing Watson of creating the toxic work environment, is that Sarver's not going to be good with black people having a whole lot of power when he's the one with the power.
Yeah, and I think that's part of it. And I think part of it, again, go back to he's a billionaire. He's not used to sharing the power anyway. I'll give you another example. The guy so they're going to point to their record of diversity hires, right? The guy that they hired as general manager to succeed Steve Kerr, who worked under Lon Babby, was black. And when we hired him, everyone I know from around the league basically said, why'd you guys hire that guy? He's no good. But the philosophy as explained to us was because Lon Babby is an older white guy, they wanted the general manager to be someone who could, quote unquote, communicate with the players. And so that's how they arrived at the shore of this guy whose name I don't say because he's a piece of shit in his own right. Right? Another example of this that they do mention in this story is the Lindsey Hunter hiring. Now, you might say, oh, yeah, Lindsey Hunter was the assistant coach, and then he made the head coach. What's the big deal? Well, the big deal was, at the time, Lindsey Hunter had never coached, had 1 year of player development on his resume, and he was sitting behind the bench. And the guys on that staff in front of him were Dan Marley, who had been with the organization several years and had coached at least a summer league team and had some experience there. You had Igor Kokoshkov, who had coached the national team for, at the time, the Republic of Georgia, and went on to coach Slovenia to a European gold medal championship with Luka Doncic and Goran Dragic. Elston Turner, who had been an assistant coach for like 100 years with Rick Adelman on successful teams. I mean, if there was anyone who absolutely should have gotten the nod, it would have been Elston. And they passed on all of them to hire Lindsey Hunter. Why? Because in their mind, oh, he's young and he's black. Elston's older, Igor is Serbian, Dan's white. But Lindsey's young and he's black. Ipso facto, all you need is a guy to, quote unquote, speak the player's language. Again, to me, that's an interesting thing, Dan. I don't know if you've noticed that, is that when places with corrupt or dysfunctional diversity initiatives try to do diversity, they think it's just grab me the closest person of color and boom, we did it, as opposed to actually doing the work of finding someone who's good at this or who's qualified to do this.
Lindsey Hunter, epically bad as a coach, laughably bad.
Yes.
Did not know what he was doing. Among the worst coaches ever hired because of a lack of experience, and everyone knew it right away on the team. There was no concealing it, right? That was a truly terrible hire that everyone recognized as a terrible hire very early on.
This was a guy who didn't know how to draw up a play on a clipboard. I mean, that's the assistants and timeouts had to draw up the plays. And so that's the level of kind of, lack of any sort of process or even deep dive. The guy who got hired to be general manager, they hired him because he showed a clip from the movie Seabiscuit. And they were proud of that. They were so happy to share with us this information. And I said, no, wait a second. Are you telling me you hired a guy because of a clip from a movie about a horse? And again, this isn't like, oh, I don't like the guy, whatever. People around the league told me this guy is not qualified to be a general manager. He wasn't doing any of these things. And sure enough, when he came over, he was someone who was ignorant about what I would call basic front office stewardship.
So what's happening here? I mean, is it just general buffoonery mixed in with an insensitivity, a privilege, and occasional just lack of self-awareness that why do I have to treat black people, minorities, women, or even human beings who make less than me with any kind of respect?
That, and then also, what kind of culture does that create when you appoint the people you appoint to be in charge beneath you? There's a story in there about, like you said, employees telling the black guy, hey, do the Carlton, right? That is because they see the guy up top doing these kind of jocular jokes that aren't appropriate in the workplace. And they say, well, we're cool. It's good. We're good to go to do these things. So there are stories about that individual who was the general manager doing all types of wild shit, like coming down on the third floor, which is basically marketing and business ops somewhere the general manager doesn't really need to be unless he's been summoned there for a business meeting, and like chatting up the female employees there. There are stories about people in the organization who are high-ranking officials hooking up and, in some cases, even marrying junior-level employees. Now, you might say, well, I mean, people fall in love at work all the time. But, yeah, like, there's something about, like, how do you end up when you're the boss or a VP-level person and you're going out with someone who's entry-level or something like that? Like, it had to start somewhere. Clearly, you guys didn't meet randomly. And like, oh, you work here too? There's an element of, yeah, like, that's happening. And so this is the culture it creates. It breeds this environment where these things become commonplace throughout the organization.
Not to make it the fault of anyone other than Robert Sarver, but has there ever been accountability from as far as you can tell in terms of the way that Steve Nash or Amari Stoudemire or Chris Paul now, like, has there been anyone who's tried to bring this to Robert Sarver?
Bring it to Robert Sarver. I believe people have talked to him about a variety of these things, right? Most often, they're people who don't probably have the power or influence to have his ear seriously in that way. So think of Corliss Williamson or Earl Watson. Earl's was like straight up. Corliss was like, look, man, this ain't cool. And then he went by another time a couple of days later to further explain himself that, hey, not everyone is going to be as cool as me, which is pretty, when you hear it from a guy named Big Nasty, like, hey, not everyone's going to be as awesome about this as I am, that usually gets your attention. But for the most part, I feel like his direct reports, the people at the top, they're people, like many jobs, they're people there because they know how to manage upwards. And for Robert Sarver, managing upward rarely involves telling them, hey, you fucked up, you're wrong. And in the instances where they do that, again, you see how many times we get oh, it was a joke, I didn't mean it like that, and I learned from that experience. But it seems there are a lot of these stories again and again.
What do you make, and we will get out of this in a second, but what do you make of the Suns after the ESPN allegations arrived at their doorstep, provided a bunch of executives to speak on the record defending Sarver, most of them white men? James Jones had a one-sentence statement: that is not the guy I know, like, and respect. Right. James Jones, the black general manager of the Suns.
Yeah. And James Jones also was a former player for the Suns back in the mid-2000s. No, to me, it was, first of all, they released all that stuff off of the hint of this story coming out 2 weeks ago, which I thought was very awkward and odd. And just why? Because, Dan, you know this. I don't know if the listeners know this. When even ESPN, the hated ESPN that are sensational, clickbait people, whatever you want to call them, when you have a story of this nature, it goes through a rigorous editorial process where multiple editors are going through it again and again and going back to the writer.
And lawyers. You need to clarify this. You need someone on the record on this. You need another anonymous. If no one's going to go on the record, you need like another anonymous source on this. They don't drop this stuff flippantly like I heard, they don't do it that way. So for them to do that before the story dropped by weeks, because sometimes these stories never see the light of day because they don't meet those rigorous standards. For them to do that weeks in advance struck me as very hit dog holler, Why wouldn't you wait until the story comes out? Because they knew it was true. They just didn't know how bad it was going to be. Like, they know that. I mean, you've been talking about Sarver running a toxic workplace for a long time. Like, this feels a bit inevitable. That felt like something, hey, don't take away my team. Like, whatever this is, I'm going to issue the denials and the confirmations wherever I need to. But that was me figuring, Sarver knows he's as unpopular as Donald Sterling. Sarver's afraid of where we are in this climate. Sarver knows the precedent has been set. They'll take away your team if they don't like you and you do the wrong thing. And that's just Sarver trying to keep his team.
But honestly, the weird thing is, Dan, it has nothing to do with us or ESPN listeners or Twitter or Instagram. The only people that matter are the other 29 guys or people on the board of governors. Those are the people he needs to curry favor with. Because ultimately, and Mark Cuban talked about this way back with Donald Sterling happened, if you take this step, you open up the doors that when we look at all of you guys' skeletons in the closet,
they're all scared of that.
We can do to all this.
They're all scared of it. Mark Cuban was the only one out there on Sterling saying, I don't know about this. Our commissioner just stepping in and taking someone's team.
And we now know that Dallas had its own set of skeletons in their closet, right? And if you think it only stops at Donald Sterling, Mark Cuban and Dallas Mavericks, and Robert Sarver, you're a fool. Everybody has something. And when you talk about billionaires, I'm not talking about everybody has something. Obviously, we all have something that we've said that we thought in privacy or whatever was a joke and it was taken otherwise. But when you talk about billionaires, they have the ability to impact and influence not only their own organizational culture, but as I said, in the case of the anti-gay legislation in California a decade or so ago, they have the influence to influence politics, to influence all this stuff, which is why when last summer in the bubble, when they put Black Lives Matter on the floor and Black Lives Matter on the jersey, like, that's it? You guys have a direct line to every senator, every congressperson, every mayor, every governor, and perhaps some of you even the president. and all you got for me is some words on the floor and words on a jersey. So I like in that regard, it's gonna sound like I'm defending Robert, but it's like it ain't just him. Now the only difference is if the other 29 don't like him, then he's cooked, right? But if they like their self-interest enough, I don't think the team gets taken away. I think Robert pays a fine. Maybe Robert serves a suspension, but he's still going to own the team and he'll be back.